Hello, everybody. It's Thursday, April the 17th, 2025. Long-time or regular viewers and listeners to the show know that I'm a big fan of John Maynard Keynes. I often quote him. Of course, he's most famous perhaps for his quote, "In the long run, we're all dead," but he had many other wise remarks, including the one supposedly it's attributed to him, although it might be from a fellow economist, Paul Samuelson. Keynes famously said, "When the facts change, I change my mind." It's taken for granted, of course, but it assumes, I guess, that we could recognize the changing of facts. It suggests perhaps that we have, or ideally should have, flexible minds that are able to change in the face of changing facts. My guest today is a very distinguished young neuroscientist and the author of a book that's having a huge impact, The Ideological Brain, the Radical Science of Flexible Thinking. Leor Zmigrod is joining us from her home in North London. Leor, are you familiar with that Keynes quote?
I think I've heard it before, and in many ways it reflects the exact way in which we should oppose ideologies, which is to update our beliefs when the evidence suggests we should.
So, Leo, I talked about perhaps the, and I use this word carefully, I'm certainly anything but a neuroscientist, but Keynes suggests that we should have what? Plastic brains? Do our brains come in plastic form, or do we build them, make them plastic, perhaps through education? Is a brain hard or soft?
Well, if you touched it, it would be somewhere in between. It's soft and a little hard. But in terms of the machinery of the brain, what we know is that all brains are just trying to predict and understand the world. It might not seem like that on the surface, but every brain is just really trying to have an accurate model of the world, because we all have these really predictive brains that try to map out reality and to be able to navigate reality in a profitable and fruitful way. And so we all have a baseline kind of sense that we should update our beliefs, that we should have an accurate representation of the world. But some of us are more flexible than others. So we lie on the kind of spectrum in terms of how rigid or how flexible we tend to think.
Of course, often it comes down to facts. Some people might suggest about that Keynesian remark that we all have different attitudes towards facts. There are certain people around politically in the United States these days, Leo, and you don't need to, perhaps for me to spell out their names, who will always dispute the facts, who will always believe that either a fact is invented or that we're interpreting it wrong. Ultimately, isn't this a philosophical rather than a neuroscientific issue, or perhaps an ontological issue rather than a neuroscientific one?
Why would it not be psychological? Why would it not be something rooted in the brain? In many ways, is there really a difference to a degree between the philosophical and the psychological? Because our philosophy should surely be based on how we tend to think, the errors and the kind of correct habits that we have in how we think about the world. So I'm not sure that I see there being such a massive distinction.
Lots of work has been done on things like the narcissistic personality, Leo, which tends to lend itself perhaps to forms of ideology. What for you, and I know that this is a question that every interview will throw at you, what for you is ideology, and what's the opposite of ideology?
Yes, thinking ideologically is thinking in a way that opposes evidence, because to be ideological is really to have kind of two main characteristics. One is to be thinking in a way that really embraces a doctrine, and this doctrine will have these absolutist descriptions of how the world works and these prescriptions for how we should act and think and behave in that world. And alongside that doctrine that makes people very resistant to evidence, very resistant to change or counter arguments, there'll be this really passionate identity, this adherence to these exclusive identity groups. And so being ideological is having this very fixed doctrine and this fixed identity that makes you resistant to evidence to the contrary of your ideological cause, but that also means that you can display really active hostility towards anyone who thinks differently. And that hostility can become violent, it can become quite injurious to yourself and to others if you believe in that ideology very passionately. And so thinking ideologically is thinking in that way that is very black and white, very fixed, very tied to a particular causal narrative about the world, and unwilling to update your beliefs in response to facts and evidence. And so that also allows us to think about what it means to think non-ideologically, maybe anti-ideologically, and we can talk about that later too, which is to see evidence, update your beliefs in response to evidence, and to think in a way that is open rather than closed, in a way that doesn't subscribe to harsh moralities or harsh identity categories, and see other human beings as human beings rather than instruments in a kind of grand scheme.
Yeah, anti-ideological perhaps suggests that we are in some way or other calculating machines when it comes to beliefs. But isn't there something attractively human, Leor, about ideology, about believing in something? Throughout most of our history as a species, we've been, for better or worse, ideological. We've believed in gods. We've believed in mystery. We've mostly believed in mythology. But isn't that what makes us human? I mean, many pessimistic late 19th, early 20th century thinkers, philosophers, sociologists, historians, Nietzsche and Weber in particular came to mind, suggested that when we lose our, so to speak, ideology, we lose whatever it means to be human.
Well, I don't know if Nietzsche thought that when we lose our ideology, we lose what it means to be human, because in many ways, he wanted people to shed moralities that were kind of thrown at them and forced upon them. And I think that in many of his writings, sometimes he writes about it as against morality, but I really actually think he's talking about going against ideology as a kind of experience that closes you off from direct experience of the world. And although he talked about what happens when people lose ideological narratives and frameworks, and that leads to this major existential crisis, I don't think that he thought that we wouldn't be human without ideologies. And in many ways, in my book, The Ideological Brain, I look at what makes ideology so seductive, because they really seem to satisfy our brain's needs to understand the world, to predict the world, to belong to a group of people who sees the world in a similar way. And so I've talked about a kind of magnetism between these ideological myths and the very nature of the human brain, which is predictive, communicative, social. And that's what makes ideologies so tempting, but also what makes them really dangerous.
And we all love tempting, dangerous things, Leor, don't we?
Unfortunately, we do. But that doesn't mean that we have to either succumb to them or that we have no choice otherwise.
Yeah, you sidestepped the Weber reference. Weber was, of course, famous for his theory of disenchantment, also for his theories of the Protestant ethic. Is this, to sort of borrow maybe from some mythologies of antiquity, is there something dangerous about ideology, that we need all our self-control, all our Keynesian rationality to fight? It reminds me of that Greek myth of tying a sailor down so that he won't be seduced by any siren song.
That's right. I think that in order to kind of fight all those pressures to think in a more rigid way, in a more kind of predetermined essentialist way, we really have to gather all our cognitive resources. And in a lot of the experiments that I've run, I've looked at how, if we go back to that spectrum of cognitive flexibility and rigidity, that the people who are most cognitively flexible in how they approach the world and how they problem solve, even in kind of everyday situations, that cognitive flexibility is a huge resilience factor, a huge protective factor against thinking in ideological and authoritarian ways.
So it's a kind of, maybe not a Protestant ethic, but a scientific ethic that you're presenting, of self-control, of not falling for the mythology of belief.
To a degree, but it's also much more grounded in cognitive science and kind of modern psychological and neuroscientific concepts, because sometimes it's easy from a sociological perspective to kind of, or philosophical perspective, to make these big pronouncements about what it looks like to gravitate to adopt and embrace these ideologies. But actually, what I show in the book is that actually measuring people's psychological traits, their unconscious processes, is a hugely influential tool for us to kind of tackle some of the philosophical misconceptions, or just even linguistic kind of folk theories that we have about what it means for a person to be immersed in an ideology. And one of the kind of most interesting cases of this is obviously in Hannah Arendt's book, The Origin of Totalitarianism, and in how she writes about Eichmann in Jerusalem. And although she was one of the most astute thinkers about how totalitarianism affects individuals, societies, and its origins, she also really thought, and this was most clear in Eichmann in Jerusalem, that there was a kind of banality to it, that really when she characterized this architect of the genocide, she was thinking that he just had this inability to think. It was sheer mindlessness, sheer thoughtlessness that characterized him, is what she wrote. And by actually using neuroscience, psychology, and cognitive science, we can really start to pin down what makes people gravitate towards those ideologies, and also how being immersed in these very rigid and authoritarian structures can be an experience that can actually shape the brain and the body of the believer.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You bring up Arendt and Eichmann. Her famous book about Eichmann and the banality of evil has, of course, had an enormous impact. I mean, my reading, and it's a very controversial book, but my reading of Arendt's interpretation of Eichmann was that he was lacking ideology, that he'd been somehow taken over by the bureaucratic mind, and he didn't think for himself. In your mind, is the Arendtian take on Eichmann that he had too much or not enough ideology?
I think that in her case, and in the way that she writes about him, she really focuses on that capacity to think. And like you say, that capacity to think independently. And I don't know what she says, or how to interpret exactly what she says about whether he is too full of ideology or too empty of ideology, but she definitely talks about him being like empty of thought, or empty of rational capacities. And I think that all the science that looks at this actually now suggests that that's just not true, and that that's a really problematic metaphor, the idea that he's thoughtless, mindless, empty of something, because it really misleads us when we're actually looking at what are the processes that happen when a person becomes involved in an ideology, embracing it passionately. What we see isn't an absence of thought or an absence of rationality. We actually see a lot of reasoning processes taking place, reasoning processes getting distorted. And so by looking and by tracing the logic of ideologies, and by tracing how information processing styles, how cognitive styles, how reasoning behaviors are altered when you are really immersed in ideology, that's a much better and more interesting way to understand what happens for a brain when it's kind of invaded by an ideology in a way, or when it chooses to take on an ideology.
Well, it's an interesting way of putting it, a brain invaded by an ideology. So you're treating ideology as a kind of almost as if it's like COVID. It's a disease, is it, in your mind, ideology?
So, actually, in the book, in one of the chapters, I really interrogate all these metaphors that we use to describe a brain that is either, so I use invaded kind of ironically, because that is how we often think about it, right? That's something that comes from outside, or kind of tipped into us by an external force, and we're just passive vessels, kind of with no choice.
We're the innocents.
Yeah, exactly. People think that the brainwashed individual is just kind of being controlled by other forces, but their inner core, their heart is not actually tainted, right? It's just something that kind of has been tipped into them or envelops them in some way. And I really go in the book to challenge those metaphors that we use and the assumptions behind them, right? Because it has this notion that the mind is a kind of container that you can put things in and take things out of, and that's not how a mind works. It's a much more complicated process of processing information, developing strong beliefs, seeing how evidence can shift our beliefs in one way or another, and that the way in which we reason, the way in which we take information, process it, and come to form decisions is much more dynamic and much more active. And we can really see how the most ideological thinkers tend to think in the most rigid ways, regardless of what they're thinking about. So it's not just that they are rigid in politics, but then really flexible in everything else. Rigid thinkers, ideological thinkers, are rigid about every kind of information, about every kind of problem or domain, whether it's about their kind of creative imagination or whether it's about solving problems and challenges in the world. They tend to think more rigidly. And so this kind of more neuroscientific and psychological approach that uses experiments to map out the ideological brain really helps us challenge those metaphors of invasion or erasure.
Speaking of metaphors and words, what about the N word, Leor, normal? Are you suggesting, and I know you write in your book about ideologues like bin Laden, the MAGA movement, Stalin, Hitler, are you suggesting that all of them in their own different ways, that their brains at least aren't normal? Or is that the wrong word to use?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's exactly the best word to use because definitions of normal are often relative, often changing, and who has a normal brain? We don't know. So I think that what's more interesting is to think about what would their brains look like. But for me, what's more interesting is what would their followers' brains look like. And what we see with these experiments in psychology and neuroscience is that the brains of really rigid ideologues, really passionate believers, are they're on a spectrum with everyone else. It's not a kind of clear binary of like there is the very kind of radical groups and everyone else. We're all on a spectrum and it's a continuum. And their brains have particular emotional kind of traits and vulnerabilities of reason and logic, and also even neurobiological differences. There have been these experiments that look at what happens to people who have experienced traumatic brain injury, and you see that if they've experienced traumatic brain injury to particular areas of the prefrontal cortex, that's the area behind our forehead responsible for the most complicated decision making, when that area gets injured specifically, people become more radical. They will see radical statements and they will think that those are fine. And so we can really start to see how particular brain structures are related to people's really sacred values and the willingness that they have towards inflicting harm on others and committing violence in the name of their cause.
Isn't there a sunny side to all this? I wonder, I'm sure you've been accused of this as well, that there is an ideology to your ideological brain or your reading of the brain. I mean, of course, I'm not going to support a Stalin, a Hitler, a bin Laden, some of the more extreme figures in the MAGA movement. But just as those people, for better or worse, have had their brains invaded, as you would put it, by naughty thoughts, irrational thoughts, unrealistic thoughts, wouldn't the same be true of artists? I mean, Nietzsche wrote about this, Van Gogh, Dostoevsky, that anything that flexible thinking is generally, it's not the best of things, particularly for a creative personality, a Beethoven, a Mozart, a Dostoevsky, a Van Gogh. That genius itself, and perhaps the bin Ladens and the MAGA people aren't geniuses, but geniuses need to fight against the notion of flexible thinking.
I don't think I agree, and I don't think that the philosophy, Nietzsche, the existentialist, suggests that that's the case, because actually to be creative, to think outside the box, requires immense flexibility, immense adaptability, and immense capacity to see preconceived essences and break them apart. And what we find is that the most flexible thinkers tend to be the most creative thinkers as well. And so actually flexibility is hugely important for creative endeavors. And actually I'll read out something that a little part from the book where I talk about this, looking also at Sartre's ideas. And I write that our creative imagination is linked to our ideological imagination. A person with a flexible imagination is more likely to be flexible in evaluating ideological claims. Rigid imagination, rigid ideologies. And I quote, "What art and morality have in common is creation and invention," suggested the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre in his celebrated lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism. Has anyone ever blamed an artist for not following the rules of painting established a priori? Has anyone ever told an artist what sort of picture he should paint? The cognitive capacity to break away from the norm underpins the artist's avant-garde experiments, as well as the non-ideological thinker's shunning of dogma and orthodoxy. So actually, to be creative is very much to be a flexible thinker who can take a fixed essence and see it in a different way.
You've mentioned Arendt and Sartre. Who else are your creative heroes or heroines? Who are models who have inspired you one way or the other, perhaps scientifically or intellectually or artistically?
One of the thinkers that I've been hugely influenced by is a very little known but very important thinker called Elsa Frenkel-Brunswik, who lived 80 years ago. And she was this incredible psychologist who she grew up in Vienna and had to escape in 1938 as a result of the Nazi regime. And she escaped to Berkeley with a colleague.
Just over the bay. I used to live there. So as most Europeans, when they escaped Europe, they ended up in Berkeley one way or the other.
That's right. And Berkeley became a kind of haven for her, but it also became a place where she could study what makes children in particular adopt certain prejudices. And she ran these incredible studies that even by today's standards would be impressive, because they involved thousands and thousands of participants. And she basically had this very audacious claim, asking whether actually we could ask children about their prejudices, and whether by looking at the way that children think, how they solve problems, how they perceive the environment around them, whether that would be a way to see who might be a potential fascist, which was obviously a question that she was very passionate about in the 1940s. And so she started conducting these studies, and in the book, I interweave some of the interviews that she ran with these children, which are absolutely fascinating, because although at first glance, we might think, well, what could children possibly say about ideologies? In fact, when you ask them, they seem to say a whole lot, and you can really see what children are the most prejudiced, the most xenophobic, and which children are actually quite liberal, quite unprejudiced, even very egalitarian in their worldviews. And so her early experiments about 80 years ago formed a huge inspiration for me, because she really wanted to see, well, could she first of all, interview these children and find out about their prejudices, but most importantly, could she use the early versions of cognitive tasks and games to study basically what kinds of minds children have, who is the most flexible thinker, most adaptable thinker, and who is the most kind of narrow thinker, who obsesses with cliches and struggles to think beyond their kind of ideological framework. And so she did these amazing interviews and studies with children that have kind of largely been forgotten. I mean, she ended up being a writer on a very famous book called The Authoritarian Personality.
Yeah, she co-authored it with, of course, Theodor Adorno, who was perhaps himself not always distinguished for his own flexible thinking.
And in many ways, a lot of the credit went to Theodor Adorno. But as I kind of I note in the book, in many ways, the experimental method to really look at the psychology of prejudice from an experimental perspective was really hers, because anyone who's read Theodore Adorno knows that he was very skeptical of a more kind of empirical scientific pursuit, and he probably shown best as a philosopher.
Yeah, how did, I mean, Adorno was infamous for not just his, maybe not so much authoritarian politics, but certainly in some ways his personality, his dismissal of jazz, and lots of other things. What kind of relationship did she have with Adorno? How did she end up co-writing the book with him?
You know, it's interesting because there's actually not a whole lot of archival material left to give us a sense of that relationship. And so she arrived in Berkeley. There were many other thinkers, psychologists, philosophers around that time. And I think that at the time there was funding by kind of American Jewish learned associations wanting to support thinkers who wanted to think about what could make a person authoritarian? Why did the Holocaust happen? And how could we really understand this in any way? And, they really focused on more like fascistic, authoritarian, right-wing way of thinking about it, and looking at what makes a person authoritarian in those ways. But in many ways, what we have now learned in many of the experiments I've run is that I've seen that when I take some of these ideas, but I measure them with the new tools that we have in cognitive science, we see that it's not as simple as just the right being psychologically rigid and the left, the liberal left, being very psychologically flexible, which was the assumption at the time. What we actually see is that when we map out the whole political spectrum from the very far right to the very far left, we can see and we measure people's cognitive flexibility using neutral, objective neuropsychological tasks. We find that actually, instead of the right being most rigid and left being most flexible, you can see that the extremes are the most rigid, and that people in the middle, more moderate, independent thinkers who are suspicious of kind of pre-established political parties, those tend to be the most flexible thinkers on a range of psychological tasks.
In other words, we all want to be like Keynes and be able to change our mind. But the one thing, Leo, and again, I'm sure you've dealt with this question a million times, the one thing that you haven't addressed, at least in this conversation, is the world itself. You treat the brain or the mind as if it's somehow separate from the world, and that we're all rational, calculating machines. But the reality of the world is deeply disturbing. I mean, in one of your videos, you talk about bin Laden. I'm not justifying bin Laden, but of course he was responding to the decimation of the Middle East. Stalin, Hitler, I'm not justifying either of their behaviors, but they were responding to the catastrophe of the First World War, of the exploitation of Tsarism and all the rest of it. You're, and this might be not entirely accurate, but you're presenting the world as if it's somehow rational and balanced, and generally it isn't. I mean, in terms of the MAGA movement, of course, I'm not a big fan of Trump or MAGA. I don't suppose most of our audience is. I'm guessing you aren't either. But the impact of global capitalism on small-town America has also decimated it. So how are brains, or how should brains respond to dramatic historical events without falling into ideology, particularly if those events have destructive impacts on your family, on your loved ones?
Actually, thinking about a person, a brain, a person's interaction with the world is really fundamental to the book, because what I look at is how, okay, we have these psychological traits that might propel us towards certain ideologies, and that maybe being immersed in rigid and closed systems can be an experience that affects the brain back. But to understand all of that, we really have to understand the environment that a person is in. And so I go through several kinds of studies, experiments, case studies, where we see how the environment around the person really shapes the cognitive and psychological processes, and how those kinds of risk factors can turn into radical outcomes in some cases, but not in others. And one key way in which to think about these environmental factors is to think about stress, because stress is also such a physical, biological process. And what we find in countless experiments is that stressing the body out immediately rigidifies our thoughts. It narrows the way in which people think and approach the world. And that makes sense, because when you're stressed, you are trying to conserve resources, you're trying to, navigate a world that feels more difficult. And so people become more cognitively rigid when they are put under stress. We even see that we can physically stress a body out by asking participants to put their hand in a bucket of ice water, and suddenly their whole kind of body responds in a stressful way, and we see that they are much less flexible. And when we kind of start to trace other types of stressors that aren't just putting your hand in a bucket of ice water, but are more chronic, larger kinds of stressors, such as feelings of social exclusion, feelings of scarcity, that you don't have enough resources or that there aren't enough resources going around, we see that brains become so much more rigid, so much more ideological, so much more authoritarian when they are put in that situation. So context and what kind of experiences and stressors a brain or a body are under is just a hugely fundamental factor for understanding what pushes people into these kind of spirals of extremism, and also for understanding how people can climb back out.
So I wonder whether the real question then becomes, in stressful historical circumstances, you get, of course, your Bin Ladens, your Stalins, your Hitlers, your Trumps, but you also get your Mandelas, your Martin Luther Kings, your Jesus Christs, your Mahatma Gandhis. What distinguishes these types? What's the difference between the brain of a Mandela, who lived through intensely stressful times, and the brain of Donald Trump?
Well, probably many things, but
not that you've had access to either of them, of course, as a neuroscientist.
No, but it would be fascinating to look at those, to study them in the brain scanner. But what I think you're tapping into is that you can have a stressful situation and people deal with it in profoundly different ways. Some people gravitate towards closed systems of beliefs, maybe to more racist worldviews, to more sexist worldviews, towards worldviews that are closed, that see the world as a fight for a kind of domination and a struggle for resources, and that one group must dominate the other. Whereas other people can reframe that, and rather than seeking that kind of competitive mindset, maybe look towards a more collaborative, kind of humanistic way of approaching the world's problems of resources and treatment and power and inequality. And there are many things that could differentiate those brains. So that can be those psychological traits, those personality traits. We even see that bodies that believe and brains that believe that inequality is a bad thing will physiologically respond differently to bodies who think that inequalities are things that should be corrected, changed, maybe removed. There's this amazing experiment that saw that when people were asked to look at videos of people experiencing injustice, experiencing homelessness, and talking about their adversity, a person who thinks that inequalities are a bad thing, that they are not natural, that they're not good, that maybe they're things that we should try to fix, when they saw that video, their whole body reacted, their heart rate elevated, their physiological arousal spiked, because they're biologically distressed at the injustice. Whereas other people who believe that inequalities and domination structures are good will actually be very numb. Physiologically, their bodies don't react to that sign of injustice. They don't seem to react any differently than they do to actually a video of coffee beans being processed. And this is really chilling, but it also shows that ideology really conditions our physiological, biological responses to the world. And so that's a key part of the puzzle that we often overlook.
So unfeeling is a kind of psychosis, you're suggesting?
I don't know if it's a psychosis, but it is a very profound kind of biological marker for whether a person kind of can empathize, can feel the problems of injury and injustice, or whether they're blunted. And ideologies, like very strong, rigid ideologies, blunt our experience of the world in that way.
You brought up Elsie Frenkel-Brunswik, the Austrian emigre from fascism, who is the co-author of The Authoritarian Personality. She's no longer around. You also brought up Sartre. He's no longer around. I brought up Mandela. He's no longer around. Do you have examples, either in the book or in your own mind, of flexible thinkers who we ordinary people can emulate, can look up to, and use as models? Of course, Keynes isn't around either. He's a kind of model too.
It's hard because politics, and especially today, seems to favor very ideological solutions, very kind of mindsets that are more dogmatic and passionate about singular causes rather than mindsets that are flexible and open. And so I'm not sure if there are any, and I'm in general suspicious of idols in some ways, because everyone is
well,
flawed.
not maybe not so much an idol, but a model, someone we can say, well, that's an I mean, you brought up a lot of examples of people who've been invaded by what you call the ideological brain, but someone without an ideological brain who we might all recognize.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a single person that comes to mind, but that doesn't mean that we don't know them individually or personally in our lives and that we couldn't become ones. And towards the end of the book, I talk about what it means to be a flexible thinker, how each person can try to cultivate that in their own lives by finding ways to accept ambiguity and to really understand that flexible thinking is not persuadability by anything. And it's also not a kind of passive moderation. You're not just finding the average of everyone's opinions and falling somewhere in the middle. To have a brain that is flexible, that tries to resist ideologies, is a brain that's constantly hard at work at balancing, being receptive to evidence, thinking about all those identity categories that we often put us in narrow boxes, that we put other people in narrow boxes, trying to resist those fixed identities, those fixed doctrines, and doing that in a very active way. And it's not an easy task because there are so many pressures trying to rigidify us, to put us into ideological camps. But I really strongly think that each person can become more flexible, regardless of where they are on that spectrum of flexibility and rigidity, and that it's probably a good way to feel more mentally free, more authentic in the way in which you approach the world.
What do you think? I'm not sure if you're an expert on her, but how would somebody like Greta Thunberg fit into your analysis? Should she be someone whose brain has been invaded by ideology?
Well, I don't know her, and I
She's a
obviously know
single
her,
issue
but
person, and
no,
I'm guessing
yes,
you're probably sympathetic to the environment as I am, but sometimes are our views on this colored by the issues themselves? In other words, what I'm perhaps suggesting in that question is that when someone is committed to an quote unquote ideology that we all kind of approve of, we don't think of it in ideological terms.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And that's one of the things that I try to raise in the book, is this question of, well, we need to think about what it means to think ideologically, dogmatically, in a way that, where you start to believe that it's okay to harm innocent people in the name of your ideological group. And we need to think that about any ideology, because it's not just what you believe, but it's how you believe. And so looking at any kind of ideological movement, whether it's one that we think is benevolent or good or ethical, is as important as studying the ones that we know to be bad. Because only by studying how all of these kinds of ideological currents can become rigid and dogmatic, that's the only way in which we can think about what progress might look like that's not tied to these very, very closed systems of beliefs. So I completely agree that it's completely fundamental to think about what it means to join any kind of ideological extremism, any kind of ideological movement, regardless of its mission.
So maybe sometimes it's healthy to have an ideological brain, a Greta Thunberg, a Malcolm X, someone fighting against self-evident injustice. It requires perhaps the singularity of an ideological brain.
I mean, many people do think that having an ideological brain is a very good thing, because maybe you need that for social change, or maybe you need that even just to organize societies in a particular way. I think that from the experiments that I've done looking at what it means to be ideologically extreme or be ideologically rigid, it's rarely good for the human individual because it stops them from being adaptable, to being flexible, imaginative, inventive, emotionally empathic towards everyone. And so for an individual, I think that being ideologically rigid or extreme is rarely a healthy thing. But some might argue that it's crucial from a societal point of view.
We've been very generous, Leor, with your brain. A couple more questions, and then I'll let you go. The headlines today, as always, are dominated by Donald Trump. And these days, the last few days, he's been attacking the university and science more broadly. He's trying to cut the scientific research of universities like Harvard and Princeton. To what extent, and you're a scientist, to what extent, and the subtitle of the book is The Radical Science of Flexible Thinking, to what extent are ideological brains, by definition, anti-scientific?
I think that in many ways they are, because to be ideological is to resist evidence, is to resist counter arguments, is to resist any information that negates your ideology in some way. So almost every ideology ends up being anti-empirical, anti-scientific in its spirit, because it resists any evidence to the contrary. Whereas that's the beautiful thing about science, is it's constantly updating itself. It's constantly open to evidence and new information, and to try to incorporate it into the grand understanding of nature. And so I think that that's right, that being ideological is in many ways fundamentally about being opposed to evidence.
And final question, Leor, easy one. How is AI going to change all this? Is AI the solution? I mean, once we all have these, once we all operate using Anthropic's Claude or OpenAI's ChatGPT, will this free us from the ideological brain? If we have smart machines, they're not going to be invaded by the virus of ideology. Is that the solution? Or might we all ultimately be in the thrall of the ideology of companies like OpenAI and Anthropic?
I mean, it's interesting because actually some of the problems with AI is that they can create a world in which it's easy to fake information. It's easy for false information to seem credible. And I think soon we will be seeing AI and maybe we already are, that there are separate AI models for separate ideological communities. And so I actually think in many ways AI is going to accelerate the problem of extremisms across the board, because it's going to create new tools by which to recruit people into extreme ideologies, and it's going to help blur the line between fact and fiction. That's why in the book, towards the end, I talk about what it means to be in digital environments that are very much radicalizing spaces, and why the way in which current free speech arguments are being used to eliminate safeguards, to eliminate kind of a good definition about what is evidence or not, what is true or not, is a huge problem. And that even any rational person in those kinds of digital spaces can become radicalized, can become ideologically extreme, because all those algorithms are actually trying to dysregulate us, to make us believe in more binary information and more emotionally volatile information. So I'm very concerned by where we're heading and how online spaces will become increasingly dangerous spaces.
Well, I'm glad, Leo, that you brought it up at the end, because we're online, but since we're at the end of the conversation, everyone now is free to switch off their machines, switch off their screens. Really wonderful interview with Leor Zmigrod. I got the name right twice. It's only it's the last time I'm going to mention the Z word in this conversation. Her new book, The Ideological Brain, is getting rave reviews, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Major new talent in this space. Leor, congratulations on the book, and I hope your next book will be specifically on AI. Thank you so much. We'll get you back on the show. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.